Everyone's seen a commando knife, but almost no one has actually seen the knife that changed the way special forces fight up close. For decades, it sat in the shadows, overlooked by historians, underappreciated by collectors, overshadowed by its flashier rivals. But the soldiers who actually carried it, the men who trained with it, who fought with it, who trusted their lives to it in the worst conditions imaginable, they knew exactly what it was, they knew what it could do, and they never forgot it. This is the story of a blade that most people have never heard of, a knife designed in wartime Britain, field-tested by commandos in the most brutal theaters of the Second World War, and refined into a design so effective, so well thought out, so fundamentally correct in its understanding of what a fighting knife actually needs to be, that the DNA of that original pattern still shows up in the kit of Britain's most elite soldiers today. Not as a museum piece, not as a ceremonial relic, as a working tool carried on active operations. If you want to understand why that matters, you have to understand what it takes for a knife design to survive 80 years of warfare, changing doctrine, new materials, new enemies, and an endless parade of alternatives, all claiming to be better. Most designs don't survive that. Most get replaced within a generation, but this one kept coming back. And before we get into why, if this kind of deep history is what you're here for, the weapons that actually shaped warfare rather than just appeared in photographs of it, make sure you subscribe right now. There's a lot more where this is coming from. Let's go back to the beginning. Not to the knife itself, but to the problem it was trying to solve. By the early years of the Second World War, Britain found itself in a situation that nobody had fully planned for. The army had been evacuated from Dunkirk. The country was under the shadow of possible invasion. And somewhere inside British military thinking, a small group of people began to ask a question that hadn't been asked seriously in a very long time. What does it actually mean to fight as a soldier at close range? Not at rifle distance, not with artillery. Right there, in the dark, where the enemy is close enough to hear breathing, and the only things that matter are what you're carrying and how fast you can use it. The problem with that question was that nobody had a very good answer. The standard British military-issue fighting knives of the era were either adapted bayonets, general-purpose blades that weren't specifically designed for close combat, or the Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, which was already beginning its journey toward becoming the most iconic commando knife in history. And the Fairbairn Sykes was genuinely brilliant in many ways. William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes had both spent years with the Shanghai Municipal Police dealing with some of the most dangerous street violence on Earth. They understood fighting in a visceral, practical way that most weapons designers simply did not. Their knife reflected that. Long, slender, needle-pointed double edge, designed for thrusting, for penetration, for the precise application of lethal force in very specific circumstances. But here's the thing that doesn't always make it into the history books. The Fairbairn Sykes, as brilliant as it was in its intended role, had limitations. Serious ones. The blade was delicate. The point, so perfectly shaped for thrusting, was vulnerable to lateral stress. The handle, elegant and tapered, could become difficult to hold securely when hands were wet, or cold, or covered in blood. The overall construction prioritized one mode of use above all others, and in a world where commandos were being asked to do everything from cutting rope, to prying open crates, to signaling through jungle undergrowth, to surviving in environments that the designers of the Fairbairn Sykes had never anticipated, that single-minded focus started to show its cracks. The men who actually used knives in the field, the ones returning from raids along the French coast, the ones coming back from operations in Norway, the ones rotating out of North Africa with experience that nobody sitting behind a desk in London possessed, they had opinions. Pointed, specific, experienced opinions about what a fighting knife needed to do and what the current options weren't quite managing. And that is the environment. That particular combination of institutional pressure, battlefield feedback, and genuine creative problem-solving into which the design we're talking about today was born. Now, the name itself is part of why this knife gets overlooked. History has a way of attaching itself to the dramatic and the cinematic. The Fairbairn Sykes gets the glory partly because its name sounds like a detective novel. The V-42 stiletto gets attention because it was carried by the 1st Special Service Force and looks like something an assassin in an old film would keep up a sleeve. The Bowie knife gets talked about endlessly because of the mythology attached to the American frontier. But the knife we're discussing doesn't have that kind of branding advantage. It has something more important. It has a design logic that proved itself over and over again across 80 years of continuous use. And that, ultimately, is what matters. What the British military, specifically the organizations developing equipment for raiding and special operations units in the early 1940s, began to recognize was that a fighting knife for a commando needed to satisfy a cluster of requirements that were genuinely difficult to reconcile with each other. It needed to be lethal in close combat, yes, but it also needed to be robust enough to survive the kind of treatment that combat knives actually receive. It needed to be usable by a soldier whose hands were cold, wet, gloved, or shaking from adrenaline. It needed to be light enough that carrying it didn't become a burden on a man already carrying a full combat load. It needed to be long enough to reach vital structures through winter clothing, because a knife that only works when a target is wearing a t-shirt is not a practical military tool. And it needed to be simple enough in its construction that it could be produced in significant quantities and maintained in the field without specialist equipment. These requirements, taken together, pushed the design away from the pure thrust weapon elegance of the Fairbairn Sykes and toward something broader, more versatile, more honest in its acknowledgement of the full range of tasks a commando knife might be asked to perform. What emerged was a blade with a wider, flatter geometry than the Fairbairn Sykes, a double edge, or in some variants a partially false edge on the back, that preserved the offensive capability of the pure fighting knife while adding utility. A fuller running along the blade that reduced weight without sacrificing strength. A handle design that prioritized grip security above elegance, with a shape that indexed naturally in the hand, even without conscious thought, even in conditions where conscious thought was a luxury the user couldn't afford. And a guard. This sounds like a minor detail. It is not. The guard on a fighting knife is one of those features that separates a knife designed by someone who actually understands close combat from one designed by someone who simply imagined it. When two people are fighting at contact range, and one of them is trying to drive a blade into the other, the blade will often encounter resistance. Clothing, bone, muscle, the target's own attempts to deflect the attack. In that moment, without a properly designed guard, a hand can slide forward onto the blade. The user can cut their own fingers. Grip can be lost at exactly the moment grip is most critical. A good guard prevents all of that. It locks the hand in position. It allows force to be applied without the user having to consciously fight against the physics of their own weapon. It is, in the vocabulary of functional design, an absolutely essential feature, and the knife we're discussing had one that worked. The handle material went through iterations, as handle materials always do. Early versions used a variety of materials that were available, practical, and cheap to produce at wartime volume. Later versions moved toward materials that offered better grip characteristics across a wider range of conditions. What stayed consistent across those variations was the fundamental shape, the way the handle interacted with the human hand, the way it sat in a grip and stayed there. Now here's where the story gets more specific, and where the distinction between this knife and its more famous contemporaries becomes clearest. The British Commandos were not one organization doing one thing. They were multiple units, each with their own culture, their own operational focus, their own accumulated expertise. Some operated primarily in Northwest Europe, raiding coastal installations, gathering intelligence, causing disruption behind German lines. Some fought in the brutal conditions of the Italian campaign, where mountain warfare created its own specific demands. Some served in the Far East, where jungle operations introduced yet another set of environmental variables: heat, humidity, vegetation so dense it could swallow a man entirely, and an enemy who was expert at exactly the kind of close, ambush-based, nighttime fighting that European military traditions had never adequately prepared for. And then there was the Special Air Service. The SAS had been founded in 1941 by David Stirling in the North African desert as a unit specifically designed to operate in small teams deep behind enemy lines. The entire concept was built around a set of capabilities that were genuinely revolutionary at the time. Long-range insertion, small unit tactics that emphasize skill and aggression over numbers, operations targeting high-value assets, airfields, supply lines, communications infrastructure, precisely the kind of strategic targets that conventional forces with their requirements for firepower and logistics couldn't easily reach. And the understanding, absolute and non-negotiable, that every man in the unit had to be self-sufficient, technically excellent, and capable of getting himself out of situations that most soldiers would never encounter. For those men, equipment selection was not a bureaucratic exercise. It was a survival question. Every piece of kit they carried had to earn its place, had to justify the weight, the space, the energy required to maintain it, and the knife was no exception. What the SAS and its antecedent units developed in terms of knife preference during the Second World War was not a preference for the most dramatic-looking blade or the one that had the most famous name attached to it. It was a preference for the blade that worked. That held an edge, that could be used effectively by a man who was exhausted, injured, or fighting for his life in conditions that no training exercise had fully replicated. That could serve as a tool when the mission demanded a tool, and as a weapon when the mission demanded a weapon. The design that kept earning that preference had the characteristics we've already discussed. Wide enough to be useful, strong enough to survive, grip geometry that worked in conditions where grip geometry really mattered, a guard that protected the user, and a blade length that represented a genuine understanding of what a knife needs to reach in order to be effective against a resisting human target wearing military clothing. The specific measurements matter here, and they're worth dwelling on for a moment. The blade on the pattern we're discussing measured approximately 6 to 7 inches in length. That's a number that comes up again and again in the history of military knife design because it represents a calculated balance. Shorter than that, and a blade starts losing the ability to reliably reach vital structures through the kind of layered clothing a soldier wears in cold weather. Longer than that, and a knife starts to become awkward to carry, difficult to draw quickly, and more of an obstacle than a tool in the kind of cramped, close-quarters environments where fighting knives are most often actually used. 6 to 7 inches is not a guess. It's an answer to a question that was worked out through genuinely grim empirical means, and the fact that the knife we're discussing landed in that range reflects a design philosophy that was grounded in reality rather than aesthetics. The steel composition of the blade also deserves attention. During the war, the pressures of production meant that metallurgical perfection was sometimes sacrificed for manufacturability. Blades were made from whatever high-carbon or alloy steel was available, and could be worked by the factories producing them. Some of the resulting blades were exceptional, some were less so. But the fundamental pattern proved its worth regardless, because a good design can survive imperfect materials in a way that a poor design cannot. The proportions, the geometry, the relationship between blade width and thickness, the taper of the edge, these things held their value across a range of steel qualities, which is itself evidence of how well the underlying design had been thought through. Sheath design also played a role that often goes unappreciated in histories of military knives. A fighting knife that can't be accessed quickly under operational conditions is a fighting knife that has failed at its most fundamental purpose. The sheath for this pattern was designed with the same practical intelligence that informed the blade itself. It carried securely so it didn't shift during movement or parachute drops or swimming approaches. But it released cleanly and quickly when the wearer needed to draw. The retention mechanism held the blade without requiring the user to fumble with snaps or straps under pressure. These sound like small things until you're in a situation where small things are the difference between life and its alternative. Let's talk about how the knife was actually used in training and in combat, because this is where the reality diverges most sharply from the mythology that tends to surround military-edged weapons. Most people, when they think of a commando knife being used in anger, imagine something cinematic. A silent approach, a precise strike, a target neutralized without a sound. And while that kind of scenario was certainly part of commando doctrine and certainly did occur in real operations, it represents only a fraction of the circumstances in which a fighting knife might be needed. The broader reality of close-quarter combat in the Second World War was considerably messier, more chaotic, and less precise than the clean narrative of the silent kill suggests. Men found themselves needing a knife when their primary weapon had jammed, when they'd exhausted their ammunition, when they were in a space too confined for a rifle or even a pistol to be brought to bear effectively, when they were grappling with an enemy and needed to end the grapple, when they needed to cut through something, ropes, straps, clothing, wire, materials that stood between them and completing a mission or getting out of a situation alive. In all of those contexts, the knife that worked was the knife that had been designed with the full range of circumstances in mind, rather than just the idealized ones. And that is what the design we're discussing had been built for. It could perform the precise, controlled thrust that Fairbairn-Sykes' doctrine described. But it could also be used with force, with urgency, in a scrambling, desperate, close-quarters fight where precision was a luxury. It could cut, it could pry. It could serve the 1,000 small utilitarian purposes that a soldier in the field encounters in the course of a day. And it could do all of that without losing its capability as a weapon. The training that accompanied it, delivered by instructors who had often used knives in real situations and were therefore not particularly interested in theory for its own sake, emphasized practical, functional technique over elaborate systems. The grip was natural. The movements were gross rather than fine, designed to work under the stress-induced degradation of coordination and precision that combat produces in the human body. The target areas were those that could be reliably accessed even in the chaos of an actual fight. The whole approach was saturated with the practical wisdom of people who had actually been in those situations and had survived them, often by narrow margins, and had drawn specific lessons from the experience. That combination, a practically designed blade and practically grounded training, is what created the reputation. Not marketing. Not heroic stories in newspapers, the quiet, hard-edged word of men who had tested the knife against actual adversity and found that it held up. Now let's follow the timeline forward, because the end of the Second World War is where most histories of wartime weapons stop, and where the real story of this knife's legacy begins. The years immediately after 1945 were complicated for British military equipment. The pressures of wartime production had generated an enormous quantity of materiel, much of which now needed to be rationalized, standardized, or simply disposed of. The special operations units that had driven so much of the innovation in commando equipment were either disbanded, reduced dramatically in size, or reorganized into peacetime structures with very different requirements. The SAS itself was disbanded in 1945, reformed briefly as a territorial unit, and then reconstituted as a regular regiment in 1952 in response to the Malayan Emergency, a counterinsurgency campaign that turned out to be exactly the kind of environment in which small-team special operations skills were not just useful, but decisive. Malaya was, in many ways, the crucible in which the modern SAS was forged. The jungle warfare of the Malayan Emergency demanded precisely the skills that the SAS concept had been built around. Patient, expert, small-team operations in terrain that negated the conventional advantages of firepower and numbers. And in that environment, the lessons about equipment that had been learned in the desert and the mountains and the occupied territories of wartime Europe were relearned and in some cases revised in the green, wet, claustrophobic world of the Malayan jungle. The knife question came up again in that context. What does a soldier operating for days or weeks at a time in deep jungle, far from resupply, far from any kind of support, need from an edged tool? The answer in Malaya involved considerations that hadn't been as prominent in the European theater. The parang, the local heavy-bladed jungle tool, was enormously practical for clearing vegetation, for making shelters, for the 1,000 tasks that deep jungle operations generate. But the parang was not a fighting knife in any meaningful sense. And a man in the jungle who found himself in a close encounter with an enemy, whether an insurgent or an animal or a piece of vegetation that needed to be dealt with quickly, needed something that could serve both functions without asking him to choose between them. The design language that emerged from this period and which continued to develop through the subsequent decades of SAS operations in Borneo, in Aden, in Dhofar, in Northern Ireland, in the Falklands, in the Gulf, and into the 21st century conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, reflects a continuous conversation between the fundamental design principles established in the early 1940s and the evolving demands of the operational environments in which those principles were being tested. What stayed constant throughout that evolution was a set of core commitments, a blade of meaningful length, long enough to be effective in the full range of circumstances that required a blade, a geometry that balanced fighting utility with everyday usefulness, handle ergonomics that prioritized secure grip over aesthetics, a guard that protected the hand, a sheath system that allowed reliable, fast access under pressure, construction quality that reflected the seriousness of the purpose. What changed was the materials. Steel technology advanced dramatically in the second half of the 20th century. The development of high-alloy tool steels and later stainless alloys designed specifically for blade applications gave knife makers access to materials that would have seemed miraculous to the wartime designers working with whatever the steel mills could supply. Edge retention improved, corrosion resistance improved, the ability to maintain a working edge in the field without specialist equipment improved, handle materials also evolved. The natural materials of the wartime era, leather, wood, horn, gave way to synthetic polymers that offered superior grip characteristics across a wider range of conditions, that didn't absorb moisture, that didn't degrade in the field the way organic materials could, and that could be manufactured to tighter tolerances, meaning a more consistent fit in the hand across a production run. The sheath systems became more sophisticated. Kydex and similar thermoplastic materials replaced leather in many applications, offering superior retention characteristics, faster draw speeds, and dramatically better resistance to the kind of environmental conditions that destroy organic materials. Mounting options multiplied, allowing a knife to be positioned optimally for a given role, on the leg, on the vest, inverted, horizontal, in whatever configuration the individual soldier's kit and operational requirements demanded. But through all of that evolution in materials and manufacturing, the underlying design logic, the specific geometry of the blade, the philosophy about what a fighting knife is fundamentally for and how it needs to interact with the human hand and the human body, stayed recognizable. If you placed a wartime example of the pattern next to a current production knife carrying its design DNA, a person who understood blade geometry would see the family relationship immediately. The proportions would speak to each other across 80 years of change. That kind of design continuity is not an accident. It doesn't happen because nobody thought to update the design. It happens because the design was right, because the people who used it in combat and evaluated it against alternatives and could have chosen anything else kept choosing this, kept coming back to these proportions, this geometry, this balance of characteristics. Because in the environment where the choice actually matters, where the test is real rather than hypothetical, the design kept passing. Let's be specific about what that means in practice, because the phrase "the SAS still carry its design today" is the kind of statement that deserves unpacking rather than simply asserted. The SAS has never had a single mandatory knife. Special Forces units generally operate with a degree of individual latitude in equipment selection that doesn't exist in conventional forces, because the nature of special operations means that the specific requirements of a given mission or environment can vary dramatically, and rigid standardization would sometimes mean carrying the wrong tool. What SAS selection and training does is develop men who understand the principles behind equipment choices deeply enough to make intelligent individual decisions within a broad framework of capability requirements. Within that framework, certain design characteristics have proven themselves so consistently across so many operational environments that they've become the baseline expectation. And those characteristics, the ones that every serious fighting knife carried by British Special Forces is expected to possess, map directly onto the design language established by the wartime knife we've been discussing. Blade length in the 6 to 7 inch range. A double edge or meaningful false edge on the spine. A blade width that allows utility without compromising the fighting capability of the point. A guard that protects the hand under the dynamics of close combat. Handle geometry that indexes naturally and maintains grip security when hands are wet, cold, or gloved. Construction quality sufficient to survive field use without maintenance tools. A sheath system that carries securely and draws cleanly under pressure. Every one of those characteristics was present in the original design. Every one of those characteristics is present in the knives that meet the current standard. The specific steel, the specific handle material, the specific surface treatment. Those things have changed because they always change as better options become available. The fundamentals haven't changed because the fundamentals were correct. There's something important to say here about the difference between iconic and effective, because those two things are often confused in conversations about military weapons. The Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife is iconic. It's the knife that appears in photographs, on unit insignia, in museum displays, in films and television dramas about the Second World War. It represents something about the commando spirit, the willingness to fight in the dark, the cold professionalism of the trained soldier who understands that close combat is sometimes unavoidable and who is prepared for it. As a symbol, it's essentially perfect. As a practical tool for the full range of things a commando knife might be required to do, it has limitations that its own users identified during the war and that have kept it from serving as the primary fighting knife in the current kit of British Special Forces. The blade is too fragile for utility work. The point breaks under lateral stress. The handle is elegant but not optimal for secure grip in wet conditions. The guard, while present, is minimal. As a pure thrusting weapon for the specific scenarios that Fairbairn and Sykes trained for, it's magnificent. As a general-purpose fighting knife for the full range of environments and situations that modern special operations generates, it falls short in ways that matter. The knife in our story is the one that solved those problems. That wasn't quite as photogenic. That didn't end up on a unit badge. that went quietly into the field and kept doing the job across 8 decades without ever achieving the kind of fame that would bring it to the attention of the history books and the documentary makers and the YouTube channels. It got overlooked, not because it failed, but because it succeeded without drama. It worked in the shadows, which, when you think about it, is exactly what you'd expect from the preferred tool of the people who work in the shadows. Now, the specific story of how this design survived, how it was carried forward from the wartime originals through the post-war years and into the current generation of British Special Forces equipment, is a story told not through official procurement documents or published specifications, but through the informal networks of experienced soldiers who carry institutional memory from one generation of the regiment to the next. The SAS has a culture of mentorship, of senior soldiers passing on what actually works to junior soldiers who are learning the trade. That culture encompasses weapons handling, patrol craft, language skills, medical knowledge, and equipment wisdom. When a sergeant major with 20 years of operational experience tells a newly badged trooper that the design characteristics of a particular knife pattern have proven themselves in places that neither of them would be officially allowed to discuss in detail, that recommendation carries a weight that no equipment specification document can replicate. It is through exactly those informal channels that the design language of the wartime commando knife has been maintained and transmitted. Men who learned from men, who learned from men, who carried the original pattern. A lineage of practical, operational knowledge passing forward through decades of conflict, tested in environments ranging from the jungle to the desert to the Arctic to the urban, and arriving in the present still carrying the core design philosophy intact. The manufacturers who produce the knives that meet the current standard, both the official procurement channels and the specialist makers whose products find their way into Special Forces kit through individual purchase and recommendation, understand this lineage. The best of them have studied the original pattern carefully, have understood why the proportions are what they are, have resisted the temptation to change things simply for the sake of changing them, or to make the blade look more dramatic, or to incorporate features that photograph well but add little functional value. Because the people buying these knives aren't buying them for photographs, they're buying them for the same reason the original was designed. Because when the situation demands a knife, you want the one that works. Let's talk about some specific examples of the operational environments where this design has proven itself in the decades since the Second World War. Because the pattern of consistent performance across diverse conditions is what makes the case most clearly. The Borneo confrontation of the 1960s. That shadowy, undeclared war between Britain and Indonesia, fought largely in the jungle along the Malaysian-Indonesian border, was one of the definitive experiences in the formation of the modern SAS operational culture. The SAS was deeply involved in the cross-border operations that were classified for decades after the conflict ended. Men operated for extended periods in jungles so dense and so remote that resupply was difficult and self-sufficiency was not an option but a requirement. In that environment, the knife was not primarily a fighting weapon. It was a survival tool. It cut, chopped, split, skinned, prepared, and maintained the thousand small things that kept a man alive and operational in terrain that was actively trying to kill him. The knives that proved most useful in that environment were exactly the ones that matched the design profile we've been discussing. Robust, versatile, capable of the full range of utility tasks without losing their effectiveness as fighting weapons. The Dhofar campaign in Oman, running from 1962 through 1976, put SAS teams in yet another environment with its own specific demands. The mountainous, arid terrain of southern Oman, fighting alongside and training local forces against Soviet-backed insurgents, created situations where small teams operated in isolation for extended periods in extreme heat, against an enemy who was skilled, motivated, and thoroughly familiar with the terrain. The lessons about equipment from Dhofar confirmed what Borneo had already suggested. The knife that worked was the one that was built on the right fundamental principles. That could be maintained in the field. That held an edge through sustained use. That could be called upon in the full range of circumstances that a prolonged, austere operation generates. The Falklands Campaign of 1982 introduced another variable: cold, wet, wind-driven rain that penetrated everything. Hands that were numb with cold, trying to perform tasks that required fine motor control. The design characteristics that matter in those conditions are the ones that the original wartime commando knife had been developed partly in response to. Handle geometry that doesn't require fine motor control to grip correctly. guard geometry that keeps the hand in the right position regardless of how much feeling is left in the fingers, blade steel that doesn't become brittle in sub-zero temperatures, sheath design that allows a clean draw even when gloves are worn. The Gulf War, the conflicts in the Balkans, the operations in Sierra Leone, the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, each of these environments added its own chapter to the ongoing operational history of the design. The desert introduced dust and sand as material enemies of mechanical systems. The urban environment of post-invasion Iraq created its own specific challenges for close-quarters operations. The mountain warfare of Afghanistan recalled, in some ways, the terrain of the original Commando raids on occupied Norway. Through all of it, the knife design that had been worked out in the early 1940s kept proving its relevance. That's not to say it hasn't been refined. The refinements have been real and meaningful. Better steel means better edge retention and better corrosion resistance. Better handle materials mean better grip across a wider range of conditions. Better sheath systems mean faster, more reliable access. Better coating technologies mean reduced reflection and infrared signature. The knife that a current SAS soldier carries is not identical to the wartime original in its materials or its manufacturing, but it speaks the same design language, makes the same fundamental choices, embodies the same philosophy about what a fighting knife needs to be. And that, ultimately, is what we mean when we say the design is still carried today. Not that the original knives are still in service, though some of them certainly still exist, and some may still be used by people who appreciate what they are. But that the design intelligence encoded in those original blades, the understanding of how blade length and geometry and handle design and guard configuration and sheath engineering interact to produce a knife that actually works under actual conditions, that intelligence has been transmitted, refined, and preserved through 8 decades of continuous operational use. There's a broader point here about the nature of design excellence that the story of this knife illustrates unusually clearly. We live in an era that prizes novelty, that defaults to the assumption that newer is better, that the latest version of anything must be an improvement on what came before, that progress is linear, and that the things we've made more recently are necessarily superior to the things made by earlier generations. That assumption is sometimes true. The steel in a modern fighting knife is genuinely better than the steel available to the wartime manufacturers. The synthetic handle materials offer real advantages over the organic materials used in the originals. The thermoplastic sheath systems outperform leather in most operational conditions. But those material improvements exist within a design framework that was largely worked out 80 years ago by people who were under enormous pressure to get it right quickly, because the cost of getting it wrong was measured in lives rather than sales figures. The fundamentals they established have proven more durable than the materials they used to express them, and that durability is the truest measure of design excellence. The knife we've been discussing was worked out by people who were asking real questions about real situations. Not what will sell. Not what will look good in advertising. What will keep a man alive when he needs a blade and nothing else will serve. The answers they arrived at were correct, in ways that have resisted 80 years of attempted improvement. You can change the materials, you can refine the manufacturing, you can optimize the surface treatment, but the underlying geometry, the blade length, the proportions, the handle shape, the guard philosophy, those things have proven themselves in too many real situations to be casually discarded in favor of novelty. That's why the design survives. That's why it's carried today. Not out of sentiment, not out of tradition for its own sake, because in the environments where it gets used and by the people who know what they're looking for, it keeps being the right answer. The irony of the forgotten blade is that it was never really forgotten by the people who mattered. The soldiers who needed a knife that worked knew about this design, passed it on, sought out the makers who understood it, kept the lineage alive through decades, when it was receiving no attention from the historians or the collectors or the people who write books about wartime weapons. The forgetting happened at the level of public consciousness, where iconic matters more than effective, and where the knife that ended up on the unit badge gets more coverage than the knife that actually went on the operations. But that kind of forgetting is ultimately trivial, because the knife wasn't designed to be remembered. It was designed to work, and the proof that it achieved its design purpose is not in any museum or history book. It's in the fact that the men who have access to anything, who can choose from the full range of the world's best fighting knives, and who make that choice based on the accumulated wisdom of generations of operational experience, keep choosing this. Keep coming back to the proportions and the geometry and the design philosophy that were worked out in wartime Britain by people who understood that close combat is real, that the margin between surviving it and not is often very small, and that the knife you carry in that moment had better be the right one. The blade has no fame to protect. It has no legend to live up to. It exists for one reason and has justified that existence across 8 decades of the hardest testing imaginable. When the lights go out and the distance closes and everything reduces to what you're carrying and how much you want the knife that was designed for exactly that moment by exactly the people who understood it best. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that makes this story worth telling in full, is that the knife designed for that moment in the early 1940s is still the knife that the best trained soldiers in the world reach for when that moment arrives today. That's not a marketing claim. That's not regimental mythology. That's 80 years of evidence, accumulated in places most people will never see, tested in conditions most people will never face, validated by the most demanding operational users on Earth. A blade that worked. A design that was right. A legacy that has nothing to do with fame and everything to do with function. And maybe that's the most important lesson the forgotten Commando knife has to teach. Not about metallurgy or handle design or sheath engineering, though all of those things matter, but about what it means for something to be genuinely good. Not good at being talked about, not good at appearing in photographs, good at doing the thing it was made to do, in the hardest possible conditions, against the most unforgiving possible standard. That's the measure that matters. And by that measure, this knife, this overlooked, underappreciated, largely anonymous piece of wartime British design, stands alongside the best weapons ever produced by the ingenuity and urgency of people who had no margin for error and got it right anyway. It sat in the shadows for 80 years while the famous ones got the attention. And the whole time, it was there, in the field, doing the work, earning its place again and again in the kit of the people who know the difference. That's not a forgotten legacy. That's a legacy that never needed to be remembered, because it never stopped